All right, Julie, we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, to my colleagues and to our audience today, it's my pleasure to call to order the 12 p.m. special Psvs meeting of March 31st, 2022. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Chair Ortiz.
Here.
Vice Chair Abernathy.
Here.
Committee Member Dewey.
Here.
Committee Member Perez Andreessen.
Here.
Committee Member Keller.
Here.
Committee Member Coman.
Here.
Committee Member Singh.
Here.
And Committee Member Prince.
Here.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Please call the next item.
Public comments.
Okay. Statements for items listed on today's agenda are given a 2-minute time limit, 20 minutes total per agenda item. If you have written comments that are longer than your verbal statement, give them to the clerk, who will give copies to the committee. If you're here to make a public statement, please fill out a public speaker card and hand it to the city clerk. Madam Clerk, do we have any public comment cards?
No speaker cards have been received.
Okay. Next item, please.
Item 3A, adoption of minutes from the February 16th, 2020 Oversight Committee meeting.
Awesome. So the minutes were distributed in the package. Do I have any questions or concerns or a motion for approval of the minutes as presented? Yeah.
Mr. President, I will make a motion to approve.
Thank you, Committee Member Prince. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Committee Member Keller. Madam Clerk, please call the roll. Or please conduct the vote, sorry.
Chair Ortiz.
Aye.
Vice Chair Abernathy.
Aye.
Committee Member Dewey.
Aye.
Committee Member Perez Andreessen.
Aye.
Committee Member Keller.
Yes, ma'am.
Committee Member Coman.
Yes.
Committee Member Singh.
Aye.
And Committee Member Prince.
Yes.
Motion is unanimously approved.
All right. Thank you, Madam Clerk. And just before we go on the next item, I will ask for the next meeting that maybe we can have a little tutorial on the technology so our folks can buzz in, and I don't have to ask you to raise your hands. But for this meeting, if we can continue to do that while you're want to ask questions or comment on the presentation, please just raise your hand and I'll buzz you in. So Madam Clerk, please call the next item, please.
New business, item 4A, fiscal year 2022-23 PSVS budget overview.
All right. Mr. Clegg, I believe this is your item.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll apologize for my voice, but try and kick to other members to help me with our presentation. But yes, as noted in your materials, today we're not presenting proposed budget items. That will come at your other meetings, but wanted to provide some additional overview. It was pretty to the point and quick in February, and felt like this is a good opportunity to give a better highlight. And then by next week, you'll be receiving materials that will be for both the 14th and the 21st, so you've got that content well in advance. But to kick off our presentation, I'll ask our budget officer, Mario Orozco, to cover a few slides for us on the high overview, and then we'll jump into some other details.
Oversight Committee. My name is Mario Orozco. I'm the budget officer, and I'm going to present the first of 3 fiscal year 22-23 budget overview presentations that we will be providing you guys. Sure. So, like I said, this is the Bakersfield Public Safety and Vital Services Measure Citizens Oversight Committee presentation, fiscal year 22-23 budget overview. Next slide, please. The objectives and outlook for the fiscal year 22-23 budget overview. First will be the PSVS measure in overview and history. that we will be providing Citizens Oversight Committee. The consistency with the 13 community priorities that the city and the committee and citizens of Bakersfield have established. And we'll be reviewing the 3 meetings that we'll be having related to the budget for the fiscal year 22-23. Today will be more of an overview and general discussion on revenues. April 14th, we'll be reviewing some of the funding proposals that were presented to city staff and that they've reviewed and will present to the Oversight Committee on the 21st as part of presentations by the various departments. Objectives and outlook. Department memos and detailed fiscal information, like I said, will be provided over the next 2 meetings. Each department will come forward before the committee and present their requests that they prepared for city staff to review and consider to bring forward to you. And staff will be making recommendations and will be asking the committee for feedback for these fiscal year 22-23 budget information and proposals, requests that will be presented on May the 4th to the City Council. The 13 community priorities for PSVS measure are in the one slide. I know they're a little difficult to see, but these are the priorities that staff and management and City Council, and we all start with anytime we're getting ready to prepare a request or see what the city's needing or how we're going to spend our various funds, whether it be, one of the top ones, increasing police staffing and improving response times, fiscal stability, expanding school resource officer programs, economic development. So again, this is where it starts, as well as with the City Council goals.
Thank you, Mario. I wanted to go over a few slides with the committee that speak a little bit to the context of the PSVS budget in light of the full city budget, and apologize for those members who've been on the committee for a number of years. This is going to feel like a little bit of review, but a good ground to cover. So the general fund in total is actually a $300 million fund. If you include our enterprise funds and other funds, it's more like a $700 million budget for citywide. So things like trash collection and sewer and wastewater, as well as the water enterprise, those are all separate funds, and projects funded under those funds don't typically fall within the general fund. And even as the general fund, again, there's other portions that feed into the general fund: property tax, sales tax, in particular, beyond PSVS. So if you look at this pie chart, it just gives a sense again of where those chunks land. And of course, the regular sales tax and property tax, other large items. But one of the things that I would reflect for this group as we walk through these slides is that if you think about all of our general funded, which is all of our public safety and all of our support services in human resources, technology, and finance, those have all traditionally been funded out of the general fund. And so the close to 1,000 employees in all of those departments were supported by the general fund. This is how the actual appropriations or expenditures were allocated out by department. And again, you'll see there that public safety, the vast bulk of the general fund outside of PSVS, as well as including PSVS. We do have other functions that help support parks and recreation, our development services to a degree. But the portions that you see under economic development, that's actually all PSVS there. And some of the general government is a mix of the different pieces of the general fund. What I would reflect for this group, though, if I could be just candid, sometimes I get the question, well, why don't we fund some of these things in the general fund as opposed to in PSVS, new projects, new ideas? There's no money in the general fund for new projects and ideas. During the initial downturn of the economy, when the pandemic began, we had actually a hiring freeze on the general fund side, and we held budgets flat for that next year after the initial pandemic hit in 2020, because there was no room in the general fund, to make those additions. One of the reasons that the city and community pursued the public safety vital services tax is because we couldn't add new programs any place. There was nowhere for those funds. Oops. Again, you'll see here police and fire.
One second, Mr.
Yeah.
Clegg. We got a question from Vice Chair Abernathy.
I don't know if this is the right point, but the 7.2 million that was spent or budgeted on economic and community development, 2021, can we see what we got for that?
We can. We don't have those details outlined in the presentation today. We're going to actually go over a high-level summary of what the initiatives and programs were under each of the council goal categories, and that will speak to most of that, but it doesn't have a line item report in the presentation today. But we'll go to that point, and if there's more questions on the details of economic development after that portion of the presentation, we'd be happy to answer those. So again, there's been modest growth in the non-PSVS general fund in the last 2 fiscal years, but it has been just enough to keep up with the increased costs of supplies and personnel and doing business. And so we're really not in a position to initiate new programs, innovative programs through the regular general fund budget. Also, often we are asked about streets and should we be spending our PSVS monies on infrastructure. And just wanted to highlight for this group that there are actually a number of funding streams that are not in the general fund or PSVS that already fund street work. We have, and this is just an example from this last fiscal year, we have a utility surcharge that provides significant dollars. We do use our CDBG funds for infrastructure, largely curb, gutter, and sidewalk, but there are other projects as well. The state gas tax and SB1 are significant numbers. The capital outlay fund is actually a general funded or transient occupancy tax funded CIP for the citywide projects, and there is some funding that goes into there for streets, but again, the bigger portions are coming from a number of other funds. And when you look at some of the priorities around public safety and economic development, our ability to incrementally add to streets works might be, could you add $1 million, $2 million from PSVS for streets in the prioritization that it may fall along with public safety and economic development? And that's still an option, but when you look at it in the scope of a $20 million budget for other streets work, the real work happens here from these other funds. And then I just wanted to point out here, this is how it actually starts to, in the operating side, show up either in the general fund or gas tax. With that, wanted to then look specifically at PSVS from this last year. And because we have the tables, it gives you a look at a couple of previous years. So we started out in 1920 at a $61 million allocation, it grew to 69 even despite the pandemic, and then this last year, close to 78 million. As you can see there, it's broken out into personnel. As of last year, 35 million of the total costs were going towards personnel. When you see that number that says operating at $19 million for last year, we do a lot of work out of PSVS by contract. We tried to look at opportunities that we could contract for services, and so that includes things like our homeless outreach teams, many of our cleanup teams, both for like the downtown ambassadors as well as our clean city teams. And then we also have funding that goes into programs like economic development business assistance tools, our economic opportunity areas, the funding for our contracts with the operators of the Brundage Lane Navigation Center, and then some of our economic development funds for property acquisition or special projects. That's what ends up in that operating, that we leverage a lot of those funds to do projects without those personnel costs. The fiscal transfers to CIP, that really means the one-time monies that are going to big projects. And so the many projects that we've done around parks go there. I think for those earlier years, some of those dollars are reflective of the amounts that we put away for reserves. And so that's where you would see that from this table. But we've been able to spend, again, as you note there, $20 million the last 2 fiscal years on large CIP projects that run a full gamut, and we'll touch on some of those in the presentation today. Again, just to graphically see where that looks as far as where the money goes. And then this is a look at the department level. So you can see that police and fire combined represent 60% of PSVS is going to those 2 public safety operations. Because we did not have a community and economic development department, you'll see that that has a pretty big chunk there, close to 20%. But that is funding all of our economic development efforts moving forward. On the development services side, I would note that all of our rapid response teams, as well as some additional code enforcement officers, represent part of that piece of the pie. So what we're going to do now is actually provide, this is a high-level summary, but this really hits on, over the first 3 years of the measure, what are the key programs and initiatives that have been funded. So of course, sworn personnel on the PD side, the 100 officers, and this is patrol officers on the street, but I think it's worth this committee also understanding that it's allowed us to restore and create specialized units. So our community relations unit, our quality assurance unit that is making sure that we're up to speed on best practices and efficient operations. Those have been possible largely because we've been able to staff up through PSVS. Also, for every police officer that's on the street, there's a certain number of individuals that we need to help maintain their vehicles and their technology and the recruitments and the processing of all that additional payroll. And so there are smaller numbers of support staff in our fleet and technology and human resources and finance departments supporting public safety. While we haven't acquired our regional radio system yet, we've set aside the monies to do so. That's a total $18 million project that would not be possible without PSVS, frankly. Also, the BPD training facility was built remodeled with PSVS funds, and it's allowed us to hold those 2 academies to be aggressive on our hiring efforts. We've also been able to make upgrades to our shooting range and property room that have been long overdue. The body-worn camera in its entirety has been a PSVS project. Also, ShotSpotter and its expansion is PSVS funded. We also have a team of staff that are funded for our gun violence intervention program that we've initiated. It's been supplemented with grant funding, but PSVS has supported our ability to stand up that program. There's also been around 20 sworn fire personnel. Some of those were incremental increases for like our arson investigations unit. But then the most sizable chunk were the 2 rescue squad teams that we created to improve our response times in our busiest stations in some of our neighborhoods of greatest need. And then there have been some fire station and fire equipment updates, which again have been very long overdue in our facilities that have been funded through Measure N. Related to homelessness, notably the Brundage Lane Navigation Center. Over this last year, we've created, well, we're in the process of the expansion, but we'll have created close to 300 beds that didn't exist. And if you add the funding that we helped support with the county and the mission and the Bakersfield Homeless Center, although those funds were not all PSVS, some of those were other funds, but we've actually increased beds in Kern County by 500 beds by the end of this year. But Berners Lane Navigation Center and its operations are a major project under PSVS. We've also been allocating $5 million a year to catch up on affordable housing development. As noted earlier, our rapid response teams that are out addressing encampments, both in noticing those encampments and letting them know that they can't be there, as well as the cleanups. And then we have the several contracted homeless support services. Some of that is outreach, but some of that is other services like navigation, as well as those that are contracted to help address the impacts of homelessness in those cleanup efforts. Related to fiscal sustainability, very large expenditures have been set aside in reserves, and you saw that at your February meetings where we've been able to increase our PSVS reserves significantly over the last 3 years. We've also set aside for those facility reserves. The $20 million ERP project is only possible again through PSVS. Some smaller dollars, but with a high impact, we've been able to develop a long-range financial planning tool. We've created a legislative program, and we have lobbyists funded under PSVS that we've never had before. We've also conducted the risk assessment, and you'll see in your upcoming meetings some small dollars to create a performance program under PSVS to help us ensure that we're getting the most out of our funds. And then there's been other important technology updates to help modernize the organization and again, be more efficient and effective. Under quality of life, that sometimes can seem like a nebulous category, but tried to highlight some of the things that stand out the most. We do have 8 clean city teams that are going throughout the city on a regular basis, and I think we still have work to do on cleaning up the city, but it's been great to have this asset and resource, and they're out helping our rapid response teams with large cleanups. And we actually recently had some feedback from the Great American Cleanup organizers saying, hey, some of the regular spots that we go to are clean, and so we're gonna have to go find some other ones. There's plenty to find, I think, is the reality, but we're making some headway there. Also, we've done quality of life work around some of our streetscapes. We had a large street tree and vegetation planting the first year, hundreds of trees and thousands of other plantings. We have funded our regional parks to really make advancements on both of those out of PSVS. And then on the neighborhood park side, we've spent close to $20 million all told on our neighborhood parks. And we still have some work to do. I think you'll see that in your upcoming meetings. But we've caught up on a lot of deferred maintenance in our parks, and we're looking forward to being able to go in and make some upgrades and not just updates. Our parks department also has rapid response teams that don't respond to encampments the same way that our code rapid response teams do, but that they're out there doing quick maintenance in the parks to make sure we're fixing things timely to avoid that broken window theory. And so we have funded teams in parks around that. We also have funded $1 million each year in street lighting, and we know there's a lot more work to do there. We assume that will probably be an ongoing ask for a number of years until we put street lights up everywhere we feel they should be, but that is also a PSVS project. And then, as I noted earlier on the personnel side, we did add, I think, 7 code enforcement officers just for regular code enforcement to be able to get at a clean and beautiful city in a more proactive way. Around economic development, we did not have a department, and so a large amount of that funding is to hire the roughly, I think, 18, 20 employees in the department. Also, we've set aside funds to create those business assistance and incentive tools to help our small businesses be successful. We've set aside funding for the implementation of our economic development strategic plan. We haven't seen those monies all go out yet, but it's there to help us facilitate key projects if we are doing or trying to bring a location or company or concept forward for one of our target industry clusters. We want to have those dollars available to create those jobs and bring the right kind of projects here. Also funded under Psvs is an electronic development permit system which will significantly streamline our development process. And then not large dollars, but there are some dollars that have gone to supporting pretty impactful long-term efforts around annexation in our general plan update. Most of the general plan update is funded through the Development Services Fund, which is separate from PSVS, but we put some general staffing there to make sure that those projects are successful. And then we have had a number of event venue upgrades, and those were actually not just deferred maintenance, but we've seen some upgrades at our amphitheater, our arena, and our ice rink. We actually have not done a lot of work under infrastructure under PSVS. We've actually focused largely first on public safety, homelessness. That was in the first 2 years. Last year, we really got much more active around economic development. And so we've done a little bit of work around infrastructure, but not much. We've had some beautification projects that were not really able to be grant funded or come out of those existing street maintenance or repaving, and to try and improve the look and feel of the city. We've had some projects funded for creating complete streets, and again, we feel like that touches upon quality of life and economic development, but it's an infrastructure project that is creating more walkability and better environments in some of our key business districts to help with revitalization efforts. And then we have had some dollars go towards the concept for hardscaping our highway corridors. We know that that's a long-term goal and would take a multi-year phase, but wanted to start chipping away at creating a better look and feel within our highway corridors, as well as lower maintenance costs. Similarly here, we have a council goal for improving the city's image and customer service. We've only funded, I think, around $250,000 total towards this in this last year, but did want to note that we have created an employee development fund that is designed to increase the skills and abilities of our employees through training and through workshops. And we've done several customer service workshops over this last 2 years. And then also we've created a new help customer service team that's in the city manager's office. It's 2 employees who are really our tip of the spear on all constituent issues that anyone who calls in, emails in, goes to the website. We have a new tracking system where it's all gathered into one place and responded from there to improve our customer service. Lastly, there is the council goal on urban renewal and downtown redevelopment. We have some dollars actually in that economic development bucket. We've had $1.2 million each of the last fiscal years set aside to acquire properties in the downtown area to help with redevelopment efforts there. As I noted, we've added funds to economic opportunity areas to make more grants possible to small businesses to improve their facades and infrastructure. We've completed a study in the downtown to create streetscapes for complete streets in the downtown. And then at mid-year, you actually saw this item for the downtown development program to set aside funds to help us facilitate greater development in the downtown. Outside of the downtown, we actually had $3 million in last year's budget to help with just community revitalization in our disadvantaged neighborhoods. And that looks like building infrastructure, streetlights, improved sidewalks and crosswalks and curbs in some of our most disadvantaged neighborhoods so that we create the fixed window as opposed to broken window mindset. And the hope is that that will stimulate private investment in those same neighborhoods after the city makes infrastructure investments there. A couple of smaller items, but still notable. We did an update on all of our banners. We have hired private security specific for the challenges within downtown, and have unique cleanup teams, including, for example, human waste cleanup, specific to downtown to address some of the challenges there and support its revitalization. So again, that was a pretty quick overview. We don't ask the Oversight Committee to, go back and look at all of the programs that have been approved in prior fiscal years, but wanted to give a sense of where has the money gone, what have been some of the programs we've been doing, because you may have a thought or question, as we provide those presentations to you at the next two meetings and say, well, why aren't we doing more around, let's say, economic development, but at least having some sense of where those funds have gone in previous years will help in contemplating, the ways that we continue to spend the available funds under PSVS in our upcoming presentations. I'm going to pause there and see if there's questions on any of these update pieces, and then we're actually going to transition into some of our revenue projections for next year's budget.
Committee Member Keller.
Two quick questions. One was that you mentioned that we really haven't been able to do anything because there's been no demonstrable increase in the general fund. Do you have any timeline forecast on if and or when that will happen?
That's a great question. I can only answer that because PSVS money's funded our long-range financial planning tool. The big outlying cost is personnel costs. So we make up about 80% of the general fund. And one of our challenges is that actually we feel like we're actually a little bit below market on our compensation. We're going forward with a compensation study that the council has approved. That actually was able to be funded out of one-time monies from the general fund from last year. But we assume that there's going to be some adjustments there for us to really stay competitive on compensation. Part of the overall compensation considerations are the pension costs, and I think everyone who's read up on this knows that CalPERS has not always seen the rates of return that they've planned or hoped for, and it's caused what people sort of call the spike in overall CalPERS costs. When they don't make the returns that they hope for or plan for, they pass it on to us, the local governments who fund the system. And so for about an 8 or 10 year period, we're still seeing increases in our projections on CalPERS costs. But after about that 10-year period, that sort of bump or apex of those pension costs starts to level out. And so after 10 years, we do think that there could be some growth in the general fund beyond where we're at today. But that's a long time frame to be still another 8-10 years out. And that may, I think the good news is over a 20-30 year period, we've seen that growth after the 10 years. That can help defray some of the cost increases we expect to see coming out of our market compensation study. But those will probably, those future year revenues will probably go a lot to being at market competitive rates. But it is good news, and in about 8 to 10 years, we think we'll start seeing more notable growth in the general fund.
Okay. Thank you, sir. And then real quick question on the pie chart that shows the distribution of the major dollars right now as percentages. Do you foresee over time that demonstrably changing such that, as an example, economic benefit may not have quite the amount of percentage because of the, I'll say, the front load costs that you put in with them?
I think I don't see it shifting a lot over time. I think you'll still see public safety having a bulk of that. I think on the economic development side, we probably will see a little bit of a leveling out. It was funny, Mr. Saldana was joking with me the other day that we're not making big asks on the economic development side this year because over the last 2 years, we really ramped that up. We're not adding to it much this year. So its share might go down a little bit over time, but I think some of the aspects like quality of life and infrastructure, we might see those increase slightly. as we're able to address, because, you know, like the ERP, the radios, the reserves were taking up really big chunks of the available funds. I think we're unfortunate to be in a position now where we can say, you know, should we look at some of these other aspects that will really improve our quality of life? And again, I think those have economic development impacts. And so I could potentially see that share growing a little bit, but I don't think it would really have a big impact on the big chunks like public safety.
Thank you, sir.
Committee Member Coleman and then Vice Chair Abernathy.
Thank you, Chair Ortiz. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Clegg, for this presentation. I really appreciate the work that you've done and the work your staff has done. I have a couple of questions that just trying to get straight in my mind. On the sales tax, we keep the 1% increase sales tax. What percentage of the general sales tax do we get to the city? Somebody's told me that before, and I don't remember what it is.
I think I'll ask our finance director, Randy McKeegan, if he can speak a little bit to this item. For sake of clarity, are you asked, because we have a 1% Bradley Burns regular sales tax and a 1% public safety vital services, so it's 1 and 1.
Okay.
And are you asking what the percentage number is?
So out of because before it went to the 8 1/4, it was 7 and change, right? And so, did we get 1% of that then, or did we get more than 1% of that?
Go ahead, Randy.
Sure. Through the chair, committee member Coleman. Yes, we got 1% of the 7.5. So that in the current year, it's about $70 million was the budget. So, yeah, that was all we got. We didn't get any more than 1%. It was all general fund dollars before the PSVS was initiated.
Okay.
And if I may, with the addition of PSVS, we're now getting a full 2%. Before it was just the 1%. And PSVS, because it's a sales and use tax, is a little different. And so the 1% that we get for Bradley Burns doesn't always add up to the same in collections for sales and use, because we actually see a higher amount of revenues come in on the sales and use. And I can't explain why. Randy maybe can.
I was going to touch on that later.
That's true. It's in our next few slides.
And then we do get an occupancy tax on top of that from like people that visit hotels and that kind of thing here in the community?
Yes, that's a separate revenue stream that we keep track of, and actually
right.
it's separate in a separate fund, the transient occupancy tax.
Okay. And I'm just kind of hitting all these so I can just interrupt you one time. The proposed for 2021, the personnel costs of $35 million. I guess I was having trouble following that because we were talking about adding 100 officers and 20 firefighters, and I just didn't get 35 million out of that. Is this additional personnel, or are we paying for some of the personnel that was already pre-existing?
Great question, Committee Member Coleman. I would point your attention to the next slide that's up on the screen now. Is in total, we've added 304 positions to the city through PSVS. You'll see that 160 of those are police. We do have support staff within the police department, in addition to the 100 officers. But you will see there, small numbers in finance, human resources, city manager's office. Some of that is related to our new strategic program. Some of that is related to constituent services. Technology services saw a bigger increase for two reasons. One, because of the significant demand of technology in 21st century for policing and fire, but also we were just really behind in technology. And this offered us an opportunity to catch up. Again, in recreation and parks, it's largely our rapid response teams as well as a few additional staff. Like last year, we added staff to regular maintenance crews for the Kern River Parkway to address some of the cleanup efforts there. And then on the development services side, that's mostly rapid response teams along with 7 code enforcement officers. And then economic development, it's the bulk of the department comes from PSVS. To answer your second question from there, it is not funding any positions that existed before. These are all new positions. And initially, there was a big emphasis on addressing public safety increases. And subsequent to that, we've said, any new position has to be tied to one of the strategic initiatives of the city. What new value is that going to add to us, like the customer service team that I mentioned? So these are all new positions.
And if I may ask one last question. So I'm watching the trend of this as we grow personnel and personnel dollars. When does it become that this 1% vital services tax become non-discretional?
I think if we aren't paying close attention to it very soon, but let me give context to that. You'll see in your next two meetings, and it's a great question because that's really the point at which we are now. In your next two meetings, you will see a few personnel requests. There's some on, again, the code side in particular, and on the PD side that our police department still really not at optimal staffing in some areas like our property room or dispatch, for example, to support our officer efforts out on the streets. But the amount of increase in this coming year is going to be much smaller than it has been in previous years. So the first year, 120 employees, second year, 90, third year, 70. This coming year, I'm trying to remember what some of the proposed numbers are, but it's probably 24 at most. And so we're really at a point where we're reaching a good right sizing of the organization, things we couldn't do before we're able to do now. And the number of staff that would be added, what I would compare it to is, for example, even on the general fund side, let's say we see a 5% uptick in revenues. Most of that's going to get eaten up in just increased costs in doing business, but can you add one or two positions? Probably. I see on the Psvs side over time, 100 officers is not going to be enough forever. In fact, we've done a recent space needs assessment that included a staffing assessment along with it, and it estimates that we're pretty close to where our staffing should be now, but over the next 5 years, we probably need to go up another 16 or 17 officers. So I do see PSVS staffing growing, in less than a 5% mark that might be consistent with the revenue increases over time, but we're really at a point where we need to protect the remaining funds in PSVS to get at our big projects, our capital projects, and our other large initiatives. And so making sure there's that $20 or $30 million every year in PSVS to get at those big projects is something that we want to do, and the ongoing costs will continue to be a much smaller growth in this year, coming year proposed, as well as future years.
Thank you very much for your question. Commissioner Chair Ortiz, I have no further questions at this time. Thank you.
Vice Chair Abernathy.
Clarify on the police. November 18, people voted for this proposal. How many policemen, not so much other staff, did we have? I know we've replaced retirees and people that have moved, versus how many do we have November 2021?
November 2021?
Well, at the end of 2021, since that's how you...
Got it. So I'm gonna try not to, excuse me, try not to throw too many numbers at you, but there's sort of two baseline numbers. When the tax was passed, there were 387 officers on the job. However, there were 407 officers budgeted or authorized. We just had vacancies. We were hiring up. Today, there are 507 officers authorized, so that's the 100 additional officers from 407 to 507. But we do know we still had that catch up from 387. We were short 20 to begin with. So as of today, what I can tell you is we started our second Academy of the Year Monday, or was it, maybe it was last week. It was this week, actually, sorry. I'm moving fast. This Monday, we started the new Academy with 35 recruits. So with those 35 recruits, it's an 88 officer net gain from 387. We know that they're not fully trained and on the streets yet, but we're filling those positions. We can't fill positions unless they're budgeted. So we're at an 88 net gain with those new recruits from the 387, but that still puts us at about we're still short more than 30 officers from the total authorized budgeted positions. So we're going to continue to hold 2 academies this year because we think it'll probably take at least 2 academies to get another net gain of 30 by the end of this next fiscal year. I would also just share a quick number. We had this in a public safety update that we were going to present to council at our last council meeting, but one of our invited guests wasn't able to attend, and so we pushed off this presentation to council, but it has a full staffing update included in it. We've actually hired 220 police officers since the passage of Measure N, but with folks retiring or separating, that our net gain at this point has been 88 from the 387 number, but we're still more than 30 shy of the full 100 net gain.
And then some of these, maybe I'll just email you some of these specifics, but when you hire 20 new employees for economic development, so what did they do and what do we see for it? What does that mean? They recruited some business here or what?
It's a good question. I think it's a variety of things. I think part of it too is our reality is that all of those positions aren't even filled yet today. We've been hiring up those positions. In this pandemic world, we're finding that many of our recruitments take 6 or 12 months to fill all the positions. It's been really frustrating for us, but we know other businesses are dealing with similar challenges. But what they do is they are, some of those staff are actually managing our state and federal funding entitlement monies. And so we've actually leveraged almost $50 million in entitlement funds through the pandemic. Part of that is because we saw big monies coming in from the feds on, utility and rental assistance. That's, $20, $30 million. But we're also getting significant dollars for affordable housing. The economic and community development team handles our affordable housing, our homelessness, our community development, and our economic development. And so they're the ones that are helping to manage our contracts along with the city manager's office with all of these services that support the homeless as well as address the impacts of homeless. They're also allocating the CDBG dollars and all the projects that go to parks and curb, gutter, and sidewalk in our disadvantaged neighborhoods. And then the economic development team within the broader department is actually it's a small team, 4 or 5 member team. They're the ones that are meeting with developers, trying to help facilitate new development, getting companies to come here and so forth. I think metrics that I can't give you today, but that would be good metrics to measure over time are how many jobs are we creating? How many placements are we having from companies? How many economic opportunity grants are we giving out each year, and what's the net economic benefit for those property improvements by those businesses? So those are some thoughts and ideas, but the department is new, and we're even building some of those reporting structures for what is the work that they do.
Okay, and then finally, what's the average percent of salary pension for a city employee after 30 years?
I may just have staff double check me if I get this wrong, but it's different between public safety and the other miscellaneous employees. For miscellaneous employees, it typically is probably about 30% of our total costs goes to pensions. But on the public safety side, I believe it's 50%.
No, I meant percent of their salary when they retire. What's their pension as a percent?
Oh, well,
Many get.
Yeah, it depends very much on the years of service. So there's a formula.
Like 30 years.
If you're at 30 years of service in public safety, you're close to 90% of your salary.
And then if you're not in safety?
Probably 30 years is 80%.
Thank you.
And then I would just ask you, you mentioned that there's going to be a trending down, basically because of pensions on pressure on the general fund. So is that because, how shall I put this, the folks in the classic pension system there's attrition there? Is that the nice way of saying that they die off?
Yeah, it is complicated, but and I don't understand every detail, so I'll put it in what works for me, and if my team can say if I've gotten off base here, but yes, the classic members aging out of the system is one of the key factors. Also, though, over time, and actually, 3 or 4 years ago, people were saying it's 6 to 8 years until that spike hits, and it's been pushed out some years because the returns haven't been as good as anticipated. Prior to this last year, it was looking really far out, but then they had a 20% return year this last year, and so it kind of rebalanced a little bit. They're still behind, but it rebalanced a little bit. So some of it is based on assumptions of returns over time, but largely it has to do with classic members aging out and PEPRA members now, being the largest group in the pension fund. And then also, one of the reasons that we've been promoting a Section 115 pension trust fund, and we approved funds for that at mid-year, is that actually allows us to do some leveling out on our end of these spikes, because we're putting monies away, and if there are these bumps, we can draw from that fund that's built revenues and resources over time to help level that out for us. But just the CalPERS graphs, it's largely because of the return rates and because of the PEPRA members.
And then I just have a comment. It is exciting to see the work that's happening because we were able to deploy these funds. I can say that I love the Clean Cities Initiative, and I have used regularly like the weekend, bulky litter drop-offs, and that has, been a real asset of not having to drive all the way out to the dump. So thank you for that. And then I just wanted to say, I know that it's not, I don't know if it's PSVS funded at all, but the graffiti removal teams that have been around for quite some time. We had an issue in downtown. A number of businesses were tagged over the weekend. I think it was last week, including ours. And no one even called. We showed up on Monday morning at like 8 o'clock in the morning, and they were already remediating it. And so I just give big kudos to the public works staff, and thank you for the responsiveness. And I think part of that is this new service attitude of really wanting to improve the community. So I thank you.
If I may, Chair, I anticipate there may be some other questions. I actually have two of our team members, Mario and Randy, who, because of ERP, we're actually in the middle of doing demonstrations for those. If I could ask them to run through a couple of slides on the details that they have, and then we'll come back to we'll have time for further Q&A after they hit their slides. So I believe that okay, thank you. I think Mario is going to hit a couple of these slides real quick. How about I talk about this one?
I can wing it.
You're right. This is something I did want to speak to. Thanks, Randy. Just and it's been embedded in the comments that we've had recently. We're in the 4th full year. A lot of the critical staffing and community needs have been in the first 3 phases. We do expect notable revenue growth. That's the good news. We're going to have room to do lots more projects. Our focus has been on public safety and homelessness, as I mentioned. We've done a lot of parks work. We've been able to stand up economic development, but looking to be able to get a little more at some of our quality of life and infrastructure. And that's just some high-level expectations. Now we'll turn it over to Randy to just run us through the revenues.
Just keeping me on my toes. Well, good afternoon. Just wanted to give you a brief update, as brief as I can, on where the revenue currently stands for PSVS. So what you see here is basically a quarterly breakdown of the revenue that we've seen. We talked about it earlier. The budgeted amount for revenue for this current fiscal year was at about $78 million. We're currently estimating, based on consultant discussions, that we'll actually have $20 million more than that initial budget. So we see here that we have continued to see growth each quarter from this PSVS dollars. From the low point during the pandemic, I believe it was close to the second quarter of 1920 when we were down to 15.3 million. Oh, it's the third quarter, it says right there, of 15.3. But we've seen continual growth in our quarterly revenues from this measure. As we go forward, what we're seeing from our consultant is that the various industries continue to have strong economic activity, and so we're continuing to see continual growth in those areas. You see here general consumer goods, auto sales, restaurants and hotels, and specifically online sales as well. We touched on that a little bit. With 1% transaction use tax, we actually get the online sales directly for those activities. And as with the growth of online activity, the consumer spending is transitioning to those types of transactions. We're continuing to see that growth in that area. So that's where a lot of that difference is between the Bradley Burns and the PSVS is. It's online sales specifically that drives that. So those continue to grow, and I think you all understand that, at least I continue to see an Amazon box in front of my door almost every other day. Not from myself, but family members at least. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so again, I talked about industry breakdowns. So this breaks down based on our sales tax consultants' information. They are able to provide us that data of what the industries are driving our revenue, and this particular is for PSVS. So over a third of our transaction use tax money coming in is from consumer goods. That's your department stores, your big box stores like Costco, Sam's Club, or your discount stores like Walmart or Target. Those are the biggest driver, at least on our end, for revenues. We also continue to see growth in autos and transportation. Almost 20% of our revenues coming from sales of both used and new vehicles. And then we're also seeing interesting, for the last quarter, we've seen some significant growth compared to the last quarter of 2020. We've seen over a 15% increase in total TUT funds because of just the increase in activity. I think we understand it. The largest increase was actually fuel and service stations, over 30%, 35% increase in fuel and service stations, obviously because in 2020 we had less people on the road. So that's one of the largest drivers of that particular. And again, the holiday season is the second quarter of our fiscal year, and so we've continued to see growth, and we continue to expect to see growth going forward. Next slide, please. Yeah. And finally, this is an update. During our February meeting, we talked about where we thought revenues were going to be. We had some discussion about where we estimated our year-end revenue to be. This is actually from our consultants and where we expect to see our revenue is going to be. I said $20 million over what we anticipated in our budget initially in 21-22. And again, in 22-23, we're anticipating over $100 million in this particular measure from PSVS dollars. So we continue to see growth, but we have to remain cautious. I think we all understand that we've seen continual growth. We had a dip from the COVID pandemic, but that has recovered rather quickly, rather surprisingly quickly. But over the last 10 years, we've seen continual growth, so we need to really track that. So we're being very cautious in our projections. That $101 million is a pretty conservative estimate going forward. That said, our consultants continue to say that that growth that we've seen is expected to continue. There isn't expected to be a slowdown in the measure's revenue stream. There continues to be that growth in the consumer goods and auto sales and those types of things. And they've looked at even with the increased inflation and the uncertainty in the international economic stage, so to speak, they haven't seen a slowdown since the second quarter. We talked about the high number in the second quarter. They have not seen since the second quarter, which ended in December. We haven't seen a lot of any decrease in activity. So we anticipate, at least in the upcoming fiscal year, that level of revenue to continue going forward into the fiscal year 22-23. So we're pretty confident on that 101 number going forward into the next fiscal year. So that's all I have on that.
Randy, you just mentioned the inflation impacting the economy, but have these revenue sources or this projection of what the revenue will be, does your consultant take into account the uptick in inflation and potentially more inflation over the fiscal year?
Yes. Last week they had a presentation just about the outlook for the state revenue, and they did say that obviously inflation raises prices, raises income, right? So, but again, they didn't see that raise in inflation isn't changing spending habits. Okay. So, but they didn't want to be overly aggressive also with the inflation rising, that they anticipate significant growth because there's going to be a metering out of that and a balancing out of that inflation versus, the disposable income and those types of things. So.
And then I would just say, I mean, whether it's PSVS or general fund, I mean, I would encourage the city to think about how you budget maybe like a special reserve to account for inflation issues, especially with this much material that we're not necessarily on the personnel, but on the capital and equipment side.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, and I would just take the opportunity to reflect that, it's great we're seeing our revenues go up by, 5-7%, but with inflation at 7%, our cost of doing business is up, equivalently, and so you'll see that to do the same ongoing operations from last year's PSVS budget to next year's PSVS budget is a significant increase. The overall percentage of the budget that it represents is not, it is more than last year, but not markedly more, because we've also seen that other revenue growth, but it is impacting, the overall cost of just doing the business, and so it limits how much more we can do because everything's costing more at the same time.
Okay. Any questions specifically for Mr. McKeegan? If it's on the past presentation, let's let them go so that they can get to their meeting.
Thank you, Chair. And actually, Mario was just going to cover a couple quick slides on process, and then I'll be available for any questions you have on content.
Perfect.
So we're currently compiling the proposals we received from the departments that, as you'll see soon next week, will reflect the recent feedback from City Council, committee, public stakeholders. In this year's PSVS fiscal year 22-23 requests, you'll see fewer staffing requests, as been mentioned, than we've presented in the past 3 years. Our focus will be on major initiatives that are meant to significantly and positively impact the entire community, and will include large investments in public safety, local parks, infrastructure, and beautification. As noted earlier, we expect $101.2 million appropriations for next fiscal year, $67.5 million in projected ongoing expenditures for prior year programs, and we expect to see somewhere in the range of $45.8 million in fiscal year 22-23 proposals from department staff. For the next steps, we'll receive and file today's presentation. As I said, we're currently compiling all the different requests for PSVS funded projects, programs, staffing that we'll have departments present to you next week or on the 14th, which will be public safety, homelessness, fiscal solvency, and customer service related presentations, which again, you'll receive a packet that's similar to what you received in the mid-year presentation for PSVS proposals that clearly outlined and described the requests and the positions and the costs that'll be presented for fiscal year 22-23. And for April 21st, we'll focus on quality of life, infrastructure, urban development, and downtown development presentations. And staff will present and request that the committee make recommendations on the department proposals at that meeting. Are there any questions for the fiscal year 22-23 PSVS budget?
Again, any questions specifically for Mario? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Turning back, I think Committee Member Prince, you had some questions for Mr. Clegg. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. President, thank you very much. I do see Chief Terry here this afternoon as well. And it's probably relates to a few questions that I do have, which may actually be more of an observation and also a statement. It is in regards to public safety and noticing that 50% of the PSVS budget actually is towards public safety itself. Congratulations on the amount of officers that we have been able to at least put on the streets to help deter crime. But it's also noted nationally that the city of Bakersfield is one of the highest crime rate cities in America at this present time as well. And speaking to the community, it's a question that comes about is how is that we have the monies and funding to make sure that we have enough police officers, and we are spending more money than ever in our police departments, but it appears that crime and safety has also become a high issue in this area. And policing consists of many factors, and we are definitely aware of that. Hopefully, within the presentation that you will be making in a few weeks, we also will see some opportunities to look at areas that will deter crime as well, not just being the responders to crime, and what can be done about that, and how this committee or PSVS funding can also support in that matter. I think that would be very, very, very important. I would also like to ask a question in regards to just crime itself and how it subsets in the city as far as the different locations of the city. And it's my understanding that most of the crime is committed, I would say most of the heinous crimes are committed on the southeast or east side of the city itself. And has the city or the police department considered putting a substation on the east side of town as well, particularly in regards to, we have one in the southwest where, of course, crime is at its the lowest in the city itself. So that would be another, again, idea or concept of what can we do to prevent crime instead of just being a responder to crime. And then also, I had the pleasure of having a few people in my office the last couple of weeks who were actually citizens of the city of Fresno, who had very, very high regards and remarks about our downtown. Evidently, they stayed in town for a few days, for a few meetings, and they were very impressed of what our downtown looked like compared to the city of Fresno. So this is another example of these PSVS funds are being used, and the benefits are, sometimes we may not see them because we're here, but others on the outside are seeing them as well. So kudos to the staff and Public Works and all that you guys do to make sure our city is beautified. Thank you.
Thank you, excuse me, committee member, and through the chair, if I could offer a few thoughts to those points that you made. To the last one, I've said this publicly, but I would reiterate it again. I don't think we're anywhere close to feeling the true impact of Measure N yet. We've been in the middle of a pandemic for the last 2 years. We haven't reached our full staffing. We haven't expended all the funds in the programs and initiatives that we've identified them for. Really good things have happened, and even better things are still coming. And I would say, we'll take the win on the downtown comments, but acknowledge that we know we have a lot of work to do in the downtown, and we're going to keep at it, but we'll take that win. Specific to crime and policing, the police department has recently completed a space needs assessment for the next 20 years. What are the types of facilities they're going to need to both provide the level of sort of expertise, like special operations or training centers, for example, as well as just the space to house the number of officers we're going to need over time. And in that, there are recommendations about having having additional deployment facilities. We have the West Side substation, that there would be other facilities, especially as the city grows. The policing model is very centralized to the PD main downtown, that we're going to need other locations from which police officers deploy, and that there likely will be in East and South Bakersfield needs along those lines. The early reviews of these recommendations indicate that it's probably still a few years out, but it's coming, that need to have those deployment areas or substations. I would say about where the crime lands, I'll do my best, and if Chief Terry wants to weigh in further, he can, or prepare those comments for a future presentation. When it comes to quality of life crimes, I have seen heat maps that, those occur throughout the city. I think when you look at violent crime, you'd probably be surprised to see that violent crime is occurring not just in small pockets, but it is more concentrated, and it is more towards east or southeast Bakersfield. But there are other violent crimes, unfortunately, in other parts of town, but I do think it's a fair characterization or summarization that there's a higher concentration in east and southeast, yes. We've actually looked at staffing based on the policing zones and what staffing needs to be based on the levels of reports and calls for service and also response times. And Councilmember Gonzalez noted last year's budget cycle that the response times in the zones for East Bakersfield were longer, and despite the fact that there was higher staffing there. And so we're always looking at those numbers and that data to tell us where we need to deploy our forces. To crime in general, it is a challenge, and unfortunately, throughout the nation and the state, violent crime numbers have been up in the last 2 years. We know that we need to not only combat that through regular patrol, but through specialized programs and units. That's why we've brought forward this gun violence intervention program. We've actually applied, and you'll see this in your presentations upcoming, we're wanting to add 2 positions to that program, and we've applied for another $3 million grant to just grow our ability to do prevention and intervention specifically to gun violence and group gun violence, and that relates to gang activity largely. But there are other specialized programs. We've been in partnership with the Highway Patrol and others related to street racing as an example of needing to ramp up our motor units. Thank you to Psvs. That's actually a specific program that we've been able to ramp back up because of Psvs, our motor units, to get at traffic issues more efficiently, more timely. And actually many of the technologies that we continue to propose under Psvs are to free up officers so that their time is spent on real issues instead of on lengthy report writing and things. We're actually proposing some technologies that would remove 5 or 6 minutes off of every call from police officers to just make their time more useful. That's also why we've asked to include some of those civilian personnel, so we don't have officers in offices doing all that work, that we're having police service technicians or records specialists doing that work and getting more officers out on the streets. But lastly, I would just reflect too that what's been termed I think the national dialogue on the topic of policing as differential responses. That means that it doesn't always have to be a police officer that responds. And so in this last year through Psvs, we were able to do a pilot to have somebody from county behavioral health sit in our dispatch center and take calls that may have a behavioral or mental health element to them. Instead of immediately dispatching them out to police officers to go and respond, can we have that behavioral health specialist first talk with that individual? And I'm getting a little ahead of Chief Terry here, but we've been able to see that that individual has been able to reduce the number of calls that get dispatched out to patrol officers by 25%. That means that 25% more of their time is spent on real safety issues. That's huge. And so we'll have a proposal to expand that pilot from that one person to have somebody on every shift. There's only been one shift that person's been on, and we have 4 total shifts. We want to have one of those individuals on every shift to see that 25% reduction across the board. And I would also add on the homeless side, being able to have flood outreach go first, and then have our rapid response teams go second, and really our impact team go last. That keeps our impact team available to address the highest priority issues. To me, that's again a differential response, trying to prevent things from happening and keeping our law enforcement officers focused on the biggest needs. So I would also argue in the long run, I could see the city wanting to invest in certain prevention programs that are evidence-based that would reduce the number of calls for service or violent crimes that happen, and that's worth spending PSVS dollars on because that ounce of prevention's worth a pound of intervention. So some of that is going to be, well, some of that's already been in our budgets, but some more of that's going to be actually in the proposals you'll see over the next couple of weeks to grow that out. But again, we feel like we need to phase and meter that in to make sure that we're doing it well and doing it smart, but we are moving in that direction.
Well, Mr. Prince, I just had some, or was on a trip and had some interaction with some Fresno stakeholders, and they said the exact same thing that you said. And, you know, that did make me feel good because, you know, there's a little rivalry between our valley towns, and Christian knows that well from coming from Stockton. But yeah, they very much said that they enjoyed our downtown and the Padre, which would not have been possible without city investment specifically. I just wanted to tag on to Mr. Prince's comments and Vice Chair Abernathy's comments around, you know, the police spending and the police goal. I would really encourage not just to talk about how we're meeting the numerical goal of like net 100 officers, but when Chief Terry provides his presentation in our subsequent meetings, I'd really like to have a sense of, you know, how are the staffing the staffing increases in this round really helping to refine or serve your strategic goals? You know, whether that's deployment areas, whether that is specific unit types, how are they actually going to impact the neighborhoods, the areas of the city of Bakersfield in a positive way? Sometimes we just get so locked on the numbers. We all want to meet and exceed that 100+ officer net goal. We all want to see more spending on public safety. But how are we evolving and you know, really trying to do things strategically about how we invest in public safety? Any other comments, questions from my colleagues? All right. Well then, Madam Clerk, will you call the next item, please?
Chair, if I may, a motion just to receive and file presentation.
Oh, sorry, I apologize. Yes. Yes, so we've received a presentation. The request from staff is to receive and file the presentation. Do you have a motion? Okay. Do you have a second?
I'll second.
All right. We have a motion by Vice Chair Abernathy, a second by Committee Member Prince. Madam Clerk, please call the vote.
Chair Ortiz,
Aye.
Vice Chair Abernathy,
Aye.
Committee Member Dewey,
Aye.
Committee Member Perez Andreessen. Aye. Committee Member Keller,
Yes, ma'am.
Committee Member Coman,
Yes.
Committee Member Singh,
Aye.
and Committee Member Prince.
Yes.
Motion is unanimously approved.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Please call the next item.
Commissioners' comments.
All right. Any comments? Last thoughts? Vice Chair Abernathy.
Particularly on the last meeting, I'd like to get the materials rather than 2 days before, like 5 days before, if we're going to be voting on proposals same day. So if we could be sure to have that.
I would agree, and I think that's a common request across to all of the members of the committee.
Yeah, and if I may, we actually plan to have that out for you for the meeting of the 14th and the 21st, the entire packet by next Wednesday.
That would be we'd be very, very thankful for that. I imagine it's a lot of material to review. All right, with that, I'm sorry, Committee Member Singh. No. Okay. All right, with that, this meeting is adjourned at 1:21 p.m.